nervous, Andy?
A little bit, just because my energy is a little low. So.
Don't worry, I will help you.
Thank
I
you.
always come in.
You do.
Besides, it gives me an opportunity to have more airtime. Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with Andy Lipson. Today we will discuss a topic that Andy picked perfectly for this week's current event, given the war instigations in the media and everything. So we're going to be talking about war instigation, red flags,
false flags.
False flags, excuse me. False flags.
And Iran.
And Iran, possibly North Korea, and all the speculations on possibly mine.
Well, the topic that I was thinking about was just last week, the two more tankers. One was Japanese owned. The other tanker also had a connection to Japan, and they had been. The U.S. had said that they had been blown up by mines, limpet mines, and it was just very fishy because it didn't make any sense. Why Iran would, when the Prime Minister of Japan is visiting, basically trying to broker a peace deal in a sense, but also broker deals because Iran has been sanctioned, and so the Japanese, I think Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister Abe, is there trying to actually work on behalf of Iran to try to make it ease the sanctions, to make it so that there's not going to be a war with the United States. So why would the Iranians blow up the Japanese mines? Blow up the tankers, and so it just seemed like a standard false flag situation where the U.S. To me, it looked much more like the U.S. had set this thing up, and I sent you a text basically said that, hey, have you ever heard of Gulf of Tonkin? And I was thinking about things like Gulf of Tonkin, all sorts of other examples of false flags, the USS Maine, Operation Northwoods, frankly 9/11, it's situations where I think where there's credible reason to believe that the U.S. either directly or indirectly had a hand in the violence that they are accusing somebody else of as a way of instigating a war. So there's lots of instances of this, and I thought that's what was going on here.
And may I just give a sort of brief context of what has been happening just in this very short week?
Yeah.
Because I have been having nightmares of a possible war that we're going to have. This is in the wake of the Trump administration having accused Iran of being behind the mine attacks on ships in the Gulf, a claim that Iran has denied when Prime Minister Abe was there, right?
And even the guys on the ships have said, no, it wasn't a mines, it was actually things coming from the air shot at us.
And the USA has sent additional thousands of troops and aircraft warships and Patriot missile batteries into the region just this week. And the buildup has led...
B-52s too.
Oh, I didn't know this one, yeah. Buildup has led to fears of military confrontation, either deliberate or based on miscalculations or an accident. And this is also just when I was on the bus coming over here, I was just listening how Trump was playing down something that had happened this morning as well, where this is a drone was shot down in the air territory of Iran. Now there's dispute and debate about this, right?
Whether it occurred in international waters on the Strait of Hormuz or whether it occurred over Iranian airspace.
And it claimed that the claim is that it's an international territory. This is from the USA, but it's disputed, and Iran now has decided to take the case up to the United Nations so that they're able to determine that it wasn't just in international airspace; it was actually in their territory. This is an instigation by the USA, really an instigation by the USA, and in light of the troops being sent, and there are there's just a lot of speculation that is going on as all of this is ramping up. But luckily, well, who knows, not luckily, maybe I shouldn't have used this word. Trump was playing down this earlier. I was listening how he was playing down, saying it was possibly a mistake by the Iran. Iran is not making a mistake here. Iran has said they are fully prepared to defend themselves because they have a sovereign right to protect themselves from war with the USA. And Russia has said that they would also back Iran. They have warned for the USA not to meddle with Iran. And I wanted to add, as I told you before we were doing this, I wanted to add that this is also as Xi Jinping is visiting North Korea.
Right.
This is before, a week or weeks before the G20s meetings. And what message does that send, right? I mean, China is in a tariff war.
Yes. Trade war.
Trade war. Gracias. And in a trade war with the USA, and they're just realizing they're just not going to work with the USA, and North Korea is in this another confrontation with the USA where they cannot make any resolution, any compromise for their nuclear disarmament. So China is over there. What message is that? And I was just listening that. Because I listen to international news, that I was listening that China, state-sponsored media, is playing all these, ¿cómo se llaman? All of these North Korea-friendly interactions that they've had in the past, all these affairs they had in the past against Japan, and then later on the USA, right when the Communist Party in China was building up, North Korea was there and everything. So they are just replaying these times, looking back, throwback Thursday times, for them to be able to rekindle this love affair of theirs in the wake of tariff wars, in the wake of this uncompromised nuclear disarmament. It seems to me that China is not going to no longer going to depend or even ally themselves with the USA. They're now independentizing themselves. Iran is over there. I feel like the USA is really putting themselves in this situation where they're playing with fire in a way that they want to try to they think they're really big and everything, but they're messing with our lives because all these people are, I will use your word, gangsters. Everyone, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, they're all around. They could really do a lot of damage to us. So I'm surprised that well, it's not surprising, it's the perfect topic for this week in light of everything that is happening.
Well, yeah. I mean, this is, I think what's being, back in the start of the imperialism back in the late 1800s, it was called the Great Game, as Britain, Germany, United States, Dutch, French, all converged on Africa, and were trying to figure out how to divide up the world. And what you see here happening in Iran and with North Korea is again a new great game. U.S. peace overtures with North Korea are really war overtures with China. They're attempting to pull one of China's most important allies in the region into its sphere of influence. And China, for the first time in 14 years, is actually visiting North Korea, and they know that they're trying to pull back. They're trying to woo North Korea into their fold. And China also knows that these sanctions on Iran is not the target for the United States. The target is Russia geopolitically, but the target is also China in terms of materially. The oil that goes through the Strait of Hormuz, and 20% of all the oil production goes through that Strait of Hormuz, coming from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iran, all these places. 20% of the global oil goes through there, and that is not oil used by the United States. It's used by Japan, it's used by North Korea, it's used by China. And so the U.S. is attempting to control what oil will go through there. And the idea that Iran is an aggressor in the region is nuts. The U.S. has declared war on Iraq. It's declared war on Afghanistan. It has bases all around Iraq, going from Saudi Arabia to what you would say to Qatar, to United Arab Emirates, to Afghanistan, to Turkmenistan, to Pakistan. If you look at a map, you'll see that Iran is literally ringed with U.S. military bases. Now, those bases are partly about putting Iran in a box, but they're also about they're butting up against Russia. And the idea that a drone can be a few miles off the coast of a sovereign nation, and that's what U.S. is claiming is international waters. Would the U.S. let any surveillance drone be right outside of Florida or right outside of San Francisco? Absolutely not. They'd shoot that thing down in a heartbeat, international waters or not. All right. Now, I don't believe it was in international waters. I believe the U.S. lies on all this stuff.
I would like to saw a map. It's very not international waters. It's very close.
And I just don't. I believe the U.S. is lying all the time. And there's, in fact, I think I actually want to show, because I have a video of a guy who talks. I have Pompeo talking about how he's a big liar, and this other guy who's talking about how the U.S. needs to be willing to basically just make stuff up to be an aggressor. This is a dude who was talking in 2013. What's his name? Patrick Clausen. He's an American economist, and he's part of the Washington Institute for the Near East Policy, and he was also a person with the IMF, and now is an economist with the World Bank. And this is what he had to say in 2013.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. But I would just like to suggest that one can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition. It's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
So the reason it made me, like, when I saw that, it made me think of Operation Northwoods. So Operation Northwoods was a plot by the U.S. Department of Defense for a war with Cuba involving scenarios such as fabricating the hijacking or shooting down of a passenger and military plane, sinking a U.S. ship in the vicinity of Cuba, burning crops, sinking a boat filled with Cuban refugees, attacks by alleged Cuban infiltrators inside the United States, and harassment of U.S. aircraft and shipping, and the destruction of aerial drones by aircraft disguised as Cuban MiGs. These actions would be blamed on Cuba and then would be a pretext for the invasion of Cuba. This was proposed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then John F. Kennedy chose not to do that. So, like, there is a long history of the U.S. Being willing to use all sorts of methods to force wars, whether it be the first Iraq War, and they made up this information about babies being killed in incubators by the Iraqi troops, and that was the pretext for the U.S. going into Iraq. And then Iraq too, weapons of mass destruction, and all the lies that were told there. Colin Powell, holding up all these, things that were complete lies about when he went before the UN and made all these lies up about the use of biological weapons by by Iraq, and that became the pretext for the second invasion. So the U.S. has a time-tested tradition, and I would say 9/11 in terms of I do believe that the idea that Afghanistan was involved in 9/11 when it was clear that it was connected to Saudi Arabia, when there's all sorts of reasons to believe that the U.S. had some kind of hand in that event. I think that's another example of false flag. That's controversial, but I do believe that. So I think the U.S. has lied to get itself into so many wars, including the thing we mentioned, the Gulf of Tonkin.
And naming Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard a terrorist.
Right. And partly what they're
Yeah.
doing there is they're trying to connect Iran to Al Qaeda. So if they can connect Iran to Al Qaeda, then they can basically use the authorization for the use of military force bill or AUMF, which basically says anybody who's connected to Al Qaeda, the president doesn't have to go to Congress to declare war on them. They can just go after them without getting congressional approval. So that's why they're trying to connect them to Al Qaeda right now, which is a joke because actually Iran has actually been one of the biggest opponents of these Al Qaeda forces, and Al Qaeda was a creation of the United States anyway. So yeah.
Can I just want to say this AUMF thing because it has been almost 18 years since Congresswoman Barbara Lee cast a sole vote against the open-ended authorization of the use of military force, which was then when President George W. Bush sought in response to the September 11, 2001 attacks.
Yeah.
It was the terrorist attacks that happened in the World Trade Center.
Right.
So Bush and his successors have continued to use the UMF as a blank check for endless war.
Right.
And Barbara Lee, which is from California, a congresswoman from California, she is the only one that had said that it was a blank check for endless wars, and she had continued to object. And it wasn't until yesterday that finally, there was congressional repeal of it, but it has to go through the Senate, and eventually it'll get vetoed down. So it's almost there, but this is the first time in 18 years that they cast a vote yesterday to repeal this act.
I don't know.
But it's the UMF that is this reason for any time causing war if there is this terrorist attack, which is part of the reason why, as you had said, to link the terrorists of Al Qaeda and the Revolutionary Guard of Iran to name it a terrorist. And so this is really something that we have to paying attention to, and I'm glad that she is asking for this that it passed to repeal. But it has to still, like I said, it has to go to the Senate, and it will need to overcome its intransigence and stand by the House decision to reclaim Congress authority over war. That is, again, if people want to research more, because we're not going to go into it for now, it's the authorization for use of military force against terrorists. AUMF. So anyhow, it's just an open-ended blank check for endless wars.
Right. And I think the U.S. has gotten a lot of use out of the AUMF, so I don't see them getting rid of it. I think as long as they are continuing in the war of terror, they will use that. I think the thing that's interesting is that the most recent budget, the military budget, which is, like I think I talked about it last week, it's $750 billion, and it's pretty explicitly a budget that's used to go from regional wars on terror to go to the big wars with China and Russia. This is what Patrick Shanahan, he's the new defense secretary, who I think was recently canned because of domestic abuse or something like that he'd been accused of, but he was around when this budget was passed. So this is from the National Defense Strategy of the United States of America. It's basically the Pentagon's kind of what justification for its $750 billion budget of 2020. And this is what the Secretary of Defense Shanahan said or wrote. The operations and capabilities supported by this budget will strongly position the U.S. military for great power competition for decades to come, and will basically allow it to prepare for such multi-domain engagements. The 2020 budget includes $58 billion for advanced aircraft, $35 billion for new warships, the biggest shipbuilding requests in more than 20 years, along with $14 billion for space systems, $10 billion for cyber war, $4.6 billion for AI and autonomous systems, and $2.6 billion for what are called hypersonic weapons. These are the new weapons that Russia has been developing that basically go multiple times the speed of sound, and the U.S. is trying to figure out how to both defend them and also make their own. So this defense budget is a defense budget for war with Russia and China, and they're being pretty explicit about that. And General Mattis said this. Let's see. So basically, he was writing about how the U.S. has been depleted by years of the war on terror, and they need to rebuild their military. He says, our rivals, he added, used these same years, the years that U.S. was in war with Iraq and Afghanistan, to invest in military capabilities meant to significantly erode America's advantage in advanced technology. China, he assured the senators, is modernizing its conventional military forces to a degree that will challenge U.S. military superiority. In response, the United States had but one choice: to reorient its own forces for great power competition. Long-term strategic competition, not terrorism, is now the primary focus of U.S. national security. So we have to understand that, like, what's going on here with Iran, what the U.S. is trying to do in order to force a conflict with Iran, is really a threat, direct threat to China in terms of their access to oil, and a threat to the geopolitical partner of Russia in the region. And that's the role that Iran has played. And the U.S., ironically, through its fumbling of Iraq and Afghanistan, has actually strengthened the hand of Iran in the region. So the U.S. really, I do feels like it has to take them on directly, and that's why people like Pompeo and Bolton are so interested in pursuing this, is because each time they've got their hand in the cookie jar with Afghanistan or with Iraq, they have to double down and go farther, and now they want to go into Iran. And as you remember, I had said that the part of the Mueller investigation I did feel was an attempt to hem in Trump and force him to basically agree to this neoconservative kind of program, and that's what's happening. I think that Pompeo is now really running the show for the foreign policy of Trump. There's an interesting quote here about him talking about lying and stuff like that.
Can you read it?
Yeah. He says this. This was, I don't know when this was, but this was him giving a speech for some people, and this is what he said.
But in terms of how you think about problem sets, when I was a cadet, what's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
So he seems to be very proud of himself for being such a thief and a liar and a cheater. But that's the same guy under CIA who is now the Secretary of State. He's a liar today, and he gave his whole speech about how Iran was responsible for the tanker stuff. He has no evidence. They have these grainy pictures of people along the side of the boats. But again, there's nothing there. I think anyone who pays attention to any of this stuff should assume the United States is lying every time it talks about any of these military engagements.
Let's not forget Venezuela, or Yemen. It was just the Senate voted today to block the sales of arms to Saudi Arabia, and it's not going to pass because Trump will veto it, because
Right.
MBS is the one who is best friends with Jared. No, Jared Kushner for some of our listeners. But I wanted to say that it's really it's this U.S. imperialism always looking for ways to dominate and control, finding the territories it can, and blaming them for either being communist, such as in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, North Korea, and or terrorist in Iran's case, no, and this is why you have leaders doing what they do, such as the foreign ministry of Iran visiting China, and China making alliances behind the USA, and still accepting oil from them even when there are sanctions in place, because they're going to ally themselves, and it's all of these things that sort of give me nightmares, because it's a real possible threat for us. But it's propaganda that's being fomented so that we can all rally behind the drums of war. I really do recommend people listening to someone I was listening to today. Her name is Abby Martin, and she was talking about how state propaganda really incites these wars for us to go against countries like Venezuela, and how the media portrays those countries in a way for us to intervene. And I will take the link, because I was listening it on Project Censored on KPFA, which is not actually, which was before KPFA. It was actually done by some people in a university down south of the Bay, and they were doing things different on alternative media from mainstream media. But listening to her really got me to think about how much we are conditioned through the media to really, over time, really condition us when the time comes to support and rally behind the war that the USA, that any presidential administration, because we can go back to Clinton, which are Democrats as well, to then finally give the okay and opinions, because we've been conditioned to think that's what we need to do.
Yeah, and there were a lot of illusions. I mean, obviously Trump had all sorts of like racist shit that he said and did, and his stuff around immigration, some of the blatant sexism of him and his administration have been, everyone's talked about that. But the one thing people did say about him was that he was an isolationist, that he wasn't interested in projecting U.S. power, that he was going to bring the troops home and things like that, and that has proven absolutely false.
Obama is the same thing.
But I mean, I just be clear, like anybody who out there who thinks that Trump is somehow different from Obama or different than Bush or different than Clinton, no, and he's the same pro-imperialist, project U.S. power, and this thing that he's doing with Iran is exact proof. There were indications of it by his attack on Syria, and now he's gone even a step further. He is now essentially on the neoconservative playbook that he was so critical of when he was just a billionaire dude in that show Apprentice, and firing people and whatever. So now he's a neocon, and I think how that process happened is who knows, but that's what happens. The people who run the U.S. empire are not our presidents. They're the ruling class. It's an entire group of Wall Street, of media, of defense people, of CIA people, of NSA. They're elected officials as well. But the U.S. being an empire is not up for debate. And one of the things, like looking at this, I never really knew this, but I knew there was something called the Fifth Fleet out in Bahrain. Like basically that Fifth Fleet, which is a giant aircraft carrier, destroyer division, Navy division, that's used to basically protect U.S. interests in the Strait of Hormuz, or basically make sure that they can control what goes through there. Right? That's what they're using. Well, the U.S. has 7 different fleets, and they are all over the globe. In fact, I saw a graph that basically shows one fleet is around the Atlantic Ocean, and 2 different fleets are part of the different parts of the Pacific Ocean. But the 5th fleet is the smallest area that is monitored by one of those fleets, and that's all in the Middle East, right there around where Saudi Arabia is, and Sudan and Somalia, and just exactly where the U.S. is looking to control the most important resources on the globe, which is oil still, and natural gas. And so they plan on using that control of that, whether it be militarily or economically, to basically use that as a lever against their enemies. And so when they plan on meeting with China and G20 next week and talk about trade wars and things like that, they're going to leverage their situation, their threat of destabilizing the region and making oil not be able to flow through there. That is an implicit threat that they will be putting on China to say, we can tank your economy by going to war with Iran and making it so no oil flows out of there. We're not, and U.S. doesn't even have to act like it's trying to do that. It's just saying, what's going to happen? So the U.S. has all sorts of cards to play here, and it's willing to kill people, lie, cheat, and steal in order, just like what Pompeo said, in order to maintain its position in the globe. And that's what we should understand our country is doing. And the irony is, they've declared Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Iran all part of the axis of evil. Now it looks like they're going to go after another axis of evil here with Iran, but the real axis of evil is Washington D.C. And Britain, I guess, because Britain is actually kind of once again being a lapdog and kind of saying that Iran is the aggressor and things like that. The one thing you can say about Germany and Japan is they at least are questioning the U.S. Narrative this time. They have an interest in doing that, but I'll at least give them credit for questioning that narrative and not letting the U.S. They're capitalists, but in this case, I'm glad that they're not just falling in line. Pompeo believes that once the war starts, that they will fall in line. So we'll see.
You had mentioned the Gulf of Tonkin. I looked it up, and I did have to do some reading. Can you just maybe go over it a little bit, because I think it is the same thing that is what's happening in this current Gulf of Oman. Is it the Gulf of Oman?
Yeah, it's like Gulf of Oman, and it's what's Strait of Hormuz, Gulf of Oman, and then the Arabian Sea.
Yes, I was right. Gulf of
Okay.
Oman. You see,
Yes.
all those podcasts listening. Yes, I had my little fact checking here, though. I like to get things right. Okay, go ahead.
Well, so the Gulf of Tonkin, the U.S. was already in Vietnam, although they weren't in with a ton of troops at this point. France had been more involved in Vietnam, but it looked like the South Vietnamese government was going to fall, and the elections were going to basically have Ho Chi Minh be elected as the president, and then that was basically they were concerned that South Vietnam was going to fall to the communists. So they needed to do something to change the game. And so the Gulf of Tonkin, in I think it was August 2nd in 1964, was essentially a statement that the North Vietnamese ships had attacked the USS Maddox. The Maddox fired back after being attacked on the 2nd, and then that was the prelude to the next event that happened, which was on August 4th, was supposedly there were these shadow ships that were seen on radar that were coming and attacking, I think, the Maddox again, or maybe another ship. And these two events together were passed what was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which basically it's almost like the authorization of the use of
AUMF.
a authorization and use of military force. It was basically the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in the face of these attacks by the North Vietnamese on the USS Maddox. No one was sunk or anything like that, but was basically used as to give Lyndon LBJ a blank check to pretty much do anything he wanted to in terms of bring forces into Vietnam. Well, it turned out later we found through the Pentagon Papers and other thing that actually the U.S. had been the aggressor in these instances, and that the second instance where there were these shadow things on radar, that they knew these things weren't real. They knew this stuff that they had found on the radar was completely false. It was just something else. It wasn't Vietnamese ships. It was something else. And that the U.S. basically used their aggression against Vietnamese forces on August 2nd and used this completely false, fabricated thing that had happened as a pretext for launching their forces in there and basically we're outraged. This is, we will not stand by this aggression by the North Vietnamese. We're going to send troops in. So they basically made up something in order to justify a huge escalation in putting troops on the ground there, and then in the area, in the bombardments that they did of North Vietnam after that, and things like that. So the Gulf of Tonkin was sort of the pretext for a giant escalation of U.S. presence in Vietnam, and led to almost a decade-long war. Millions of Vietnamese killed, obviously, and maybe even tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers killed. I don't know what the numbers are, but many, and the rest is history. But it's just one of a long string of examples of the U.S. doing lies in order to justify a war.
Just a quick correction to you. The AUMF, it's authorization for use of military force against terrorists. Andy, you had shared your story when we talked about your socialist background on one of the episodes. Can you just quickly, for our new listeners, tell us again why the war?
Yes, the war in Yugoslavia.
Really
the war in Yugoslavia was another case of the U.S. manufacturing a situation where they were essentially creating, I don't know if it was so much a lie as they were going to make the defenders seem like the aggressors, and force them into a war position. It was called the Rambouillet Agreement, but I don't know. It's just another example, I guess. I don't know if I want to say too much about it.
Well, the point about it was that you realized, even with Democrats, that it wasn't it wasn't as people make it seem, that Republicans and Democrats are distinctly different.
Right.
And that the point about it is that really we cannot trust this capitalist class,
correct,
and leadership class of here, where they are beating the drums of war.
Right.
I'm trying to learn these expressions in English. But it's both parties. They're in it together, and that
correct.
Was the point. What I was trying to say from yours.
That was Bill Clinton basically creating his set of lies and justifications to make sure that they could have an excuse for bombing Yugoslavia. Yeah, I agree with you. That it was one in a string of examples. There's people who believe that FDR knew that Pearl Harbor was actually going to be attacked at the time. I mean, there's all sorts of things that, again, and pulled enough forces out to not have his entire fleet sunk, but basically he needed an event to justify bringing U.S. into World War II. So there are people who believe, and I'm willing to believe it, because I just think the U.S. has such a history of lying. The U.S. Maine that guy talked about, they knew that it was basically that it hadn't been a mine done by the Spanish that had sunk the Maine, that it was actually an explosion of a coal explosion of a furnace or something like that. And they basically went ahead and just made stuff up and said this was Spain that had done this. We're going to go get them. It's just, there's just been a long history of the U.S. using falsehood to justify their entry into wars that the people of the United States won't support unless they can be ginned up with these, with the United States putting itself as the victim rather than the aggressor.
And in my generation, it's the weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
That is really what I think my generation will remember, because because I am a millennial, and a lot of us will remember that we were pulled from school and we didn't know what was happening, but everywhere, even at Petco, the television and everything was on with the World Trade Center buildings. And in Mexico, it was all over the news. And the point being is that was for the AUMF, that's one of the main reasons why we have these endless wars.
Yeah. And then it also became the justification that 9/11 event, which, the people who pushed the war plans after that had been hoping for some, what's it called, a Pearl Harbor-like event. They had written something about even a year earlier in the document for a new American Century or something like that. That event right there not only was used to justify the war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, now Iran, but it was also used for the Patriot Act of an immense attack on our civil liberties, and it's been the justification for the NSA snooping that's been going on, and all the censorship and all the invasion of privacy stuff that's going on. So it's been used as to strengthen the hand of the state massively, and needs to be opposed 100%. And I do believe it's predicated on lies. I do believe the United States had a hand in those events. I don't know exactly what direct, but I do believe it involves Saudi Arabia and the United States, and I do believe Israel is involved in some of this stuff. And I think it's like some of these, dark forces that Pompeo is talking about in the CIA that I do believe played a role in the stuff that happened in 9/11.
And I was going to say that we should recognize our whistleblower, Edward Snowden, for having released on the NSA surveillance.
I mean, I just want to talk about this stuff and just say that we shouldn't believe the United States on anything, and this is another reason why the quickest path to peace is getting the U.S. out of the Middle East. It's the last place they want to leave, because they're using their presence there to control the globe. But that is our task here in this country, is to bring down that war machine so that the U.S. is not able to put itself in that, because they're the aggressor in that region.
I'm glad you brought this up. There's a lot. And this is a very serious thing.
We'll see whether the U.S. is willing to take it more the way, but they are playing a very dangerous game. And it's... I think Trump said that, that Iran made a big mistake, but I think he said it in a threatening way, like they made a big mistake and they're going to pay for that mistake. So the U.S., I do think Iran was trying to punch the bully in the nose to get them to back off, and I do think it surprised the U.S. military that they were able to shoot down something that flies so high. And I do think it shows that Iran is not without its own resources to defend itself. But it will be interesting to see if the U.S. now doubles down and goes even further. It seems to me that that's what Pompeo and Bolton want to do. So I do think the U.S. can't just let this stand, and I think they're going to have to take some sort of action to turn up the heat on Iran. But I think all these things they have a logic that can get out of control, and that can force the United States to take step after step after step to be more and more aggressive.
I personally do not think that. I think Trump was playing down the threat, because he said very clearly. He said that he thinks someone in the Iran military must have made a mistake. It was not a mistake. The Iran forces have said clearly out that they said the head of the Iran Islamic Revolutionary Guard, Major General Hossein Salami, said the incident should send a clear message to America not to cross Iran's border. And Trump said, someone must have made some mistake. I don't know. He's like downplaying it. No one made a mistake. It was a clear message. So I think that I do think that you said that that so high up the drone and everything, and they struck just like that. Iran is not going to just allow themselves to be bullied. I think that the USA got stunned today and felt as if, oh, they're quick. They're not just going to allow us to spy on them on their shores and everything. No, they're really, really not. It is a clear message, as the general said.
The quote that or the thing that I saw him. He was in a press conference, and the way he said it made it sound like he was like, oh, they made a big mistake. Like,
oh, he did say that.
Yes,
yeah.
And that's what I heard. So
I see.
But we'll see now. Either way, the United States is playing a dangerous game, and really, it is ultimately up to us to stop them, because the U.S. won't stop and the Democrats are going to support Trump for whatever he does. If he engages, they're going to basically get behind their war president.
Well, I wanted to say two things now, if we're all right, if we can sort of transition to.
Yeah.
there are two things that I really want to bring up. One is that today is the World Refugee Day. So I wanted to read something, that this is from Democracy Now! A new UN report finds that nearly 71 million people have been displaced last year by war, persecution, and other forms of violence. That number is more than 2 million people, higher than the preceding year, and represents a jump of 65% from a decade ago. Nearly 26 million refugees were recorded in 2018, over half of them under the age of 18. Of those, less than 100,000 were resettled. Over 41 million people worldwide were internally displaced, and 3.5 million were registered as asylum seekers. Syria represents the highest number of refugees at 6.7 million, while Ethiopians represented the largest newly displaced population last year. The vast majority internally displaced due to the intercommunal conflict. The annual report by the UN Refugee Agency was released to coincide with World Refugee Day, which is today. So I think this is not going to end. This is going to continue with climate crisis, with wars, and with more wars happening in Iran. And
there will be if the U.S. did more
continue.
in Iran, it would create a giant refugee mess again.
Yeah. And for our topic next week,
are we going to do identity politics?
Well, I want to read this. This is why I told you two things. That on Wednesday, yesterday, the House Judiciary Panel held a historic hearing on reparations. You've been meaning to talk about for slavery, the first of its kind in over a decade. Lawmakers are considering a bill that would create a commission to study the effects of slavery and make recommendations to Congress, including a formal apology for slavery. There was Ta-Nehisi Coates. He wrote an Atlantic piece on the case for reparations. There was Danny Glover, an actor well known in cinema, and he made another case. And he said a national reparations policy is moral, democratic, economic imperative. This is him talking yesterday. I sit here as the great-grandson of a former slave, Mary Brown, who was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation on January the 1st, 1863. Despite much progress over the centuries, the hearing is yet another important step in the long and heroic struggle of African Americans to secure reparations for the damages inflicted by enslavement and post-emancipation and racial exclusionary policies. So that I just wanted to share with you, because I know we've talked about it, but there are things about it that I think that we need to, potentially controversial, that I'd like for us to talk and discuss, and how from a socialist point of view that we can see it in the light of.
I feel like we should go to identity politics.
We will.
First.
I'm just saying for the future topic.
Yeah.
It's something. Yeah.
So I would hope for that next week we can start down the road of getting into our thoughts on identity politics, and then I think that would frame, I think, what we would say about reparations,
which has been long anticipated.
Yeah.
All right, Andy. Thank you for this topic, and everyone can find us on Google Play, Stitcher, BitChute, iTunes, and YouTube. Thank you very much. Rate, review, subscribe, and best of all, share with everyone.
Yes. See you next week.